Wife cheated with my therapist during marriage counseling. Now they're both facing professional and legal consequences. 6 months ago, I was sitting in what I thought was a safe space, trying to save my marriage of 8 years. My husband and I had been going through a rough patch, the kind where you feel like roommates rather than partners, where conversations become transactions about bills and schedules and intimacy feels like a distant memory. We'd been married since college, met during our sophomore year, and somewhere along the way, life just happened. Work stress, financial pressures, family drama, all the usual suspects that slowly chip away at what you thought was unbreakable. The decision to try marriage counseling wasn't easy. I'm the type of person who likes to handle things privately, figure stuff out on my own, but our relationship was drowning and I was desperate. My husband seemed equally committed to making it work, which gave me hope. We found this counselor through our insurance network, someone with great reviews and years of experience. The office was in one of those professional buildings downtown, all beige walls and motivational posters, but it felt legitimate and serious. Our first few sessions were awkward but promising. The counselor seemed genuinely invested in helping us communicate better, gave us homework exercises, and really listened to both sides. I started feeling optimistic for the first time in months. My husband was opening up about things he'd never shared before, and I was learning to express my needs without it turning into an argument. We were making progress, or at least I thought we were. The counselor had this way of making me feel heard and validated. After years of feeling invisible in my own marriage, having someone really pay attention to what I was saying felt incredible. The sessions were supposed to be about both of us, but increasingly I found myself looking forward to the parts where I could share my perspective. My husband would sometimes zone out or check his phone, but the counselor always maintained eye contact with me, nodded at the right moments, and asked follow-up questions that showed he was really listening. About 2 months into our sessions, the counselor suggested we might benefit from some individual sessions alongside our couple's work. He explained that sometimes people need space to process their feelings privately before bringing them into the joint sessions. It made sense, and my husband agreed, though he seemed less enthusiastic about the individual work than I was. We scheduled separate appointments, mine on Thursdays, his on Tuesdays. Those individual sessions became the highlight of my week. For 50 minutes, it was just about me, my feelings, my dreams, my frustrations. The counselor had this way of asking questions that made me dig deeper into myself than I'd ever gone before. He'd lean forward when I talked about feeling unappreciated at home, not sympathetically when I described feeling lonely even when my husband was right next to me. He made me feel like my emotions were valid and important. During one particularly intense session, I broke down crying while talking about how disconnected I felt from my husband. The counselor moved from his chair to sit on the couch next to me, handed me tissues, and put his hand on my shoulder. It was supposed to be comforting, but something about the gesture felt different, more personal than professional. I brushed it off, telling myself I was reading too much into a simple act of kindness. The touching became more frequent after that. A hand on my back when I was leaving, a longer hug than seemed necessary, his fingers lingering when he handed me things. I started dressing up for our sessions without really thinking about why. I'd catch myself checking my reflection in the bathroom mirror before walking into his office, making sure my hair looked good. The rational part of my brain knew this wasn't normal, but the attention felt so good after years of feeling invisible. Meanwhile, our joint sessions continued, but they started feeling different. The counselor would sometimes make comments that seemed to subtly criticize my husband while validating my concerns. He'd point out patterns where my husband wasn't being emotionally available, but frame my responses as completely understandable. My husband started getting defensive during sessions, saying he felt like it was 2 against 1. I defended the counselor, insisting he was just helping us see our dynamics more clearly. The first time anything physical happened was after a particularly emotional individual session. I'd been talking about feeling worthless and unattractive, how my husband barely touched me anymore unless he wanted something. The counselor listened with such intensity, his eyes never leaving my face. When the session ended, he stood up and told me I was beautiful and deserving of love. Then he kissed me. It wasn't a long kiss, maybe 3 seconds, but it changed everything. I was shocked and confused, but also thrilled in a way I hadn't felt in years. Someone found me attractive and desirable. Someone thought I was worth pursuing. He immediately apologized, said he'd crossed a line and it wouldn't happen again. I left feeling guilty but also more alive than I had in months. Of course it happened again. The next week and the week after that. What started as stolen moments after sessions turned into longer encounters. He'd schedule me as the last appointment of the day, lock the office door, and we'd end up on his couch doing things that had nothing to do with therapy. I knew it was wrong on every level, but I couldn't stop. The combination of emotional connection and physical attention was intoxicating after years of feeling starved for both. The guilt was eating me alive, but I justified it by telling myself that my marriage was already over anyway. The counselor reinforced this narrative, telling me that my husband would never change, that I deserved better, that our connection was special and rare. He painted a picture of a future where we could be together properly once I left my husband. He made it sound inevitable and right. My behavior at home became erratic. I was either completely withdrawn, lost in thoughts about my secret relationship, or overly affectionate with guilt. My husband noticed the changes but attributed them to the stress of working on our marriage. I started lying constantly about where I was, who I was with, why I was coming home late. The web of deception grew larger every day. Update 1. 3 weeks ago, everything imploded in the most devastating way possible. My husband had been suspicious about my behavior for a while, the secret phone calls, the extra attention to my appearance, the way I'd become defensive whenever he asked about my individual therapy sessions. He'd mentioned a few times that he felt like our couple's sessions weren't helping and maybe we should try a different approach, but I'd insisted we stick with our current counselor. One Thursday, I thought I was going to my usual individual session, but when I arrived at the office building, my husband was sitting in the parking lot in his car. My stomach dropped to my feet. He'd followed me, something he'd never done before in our entire relationship. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, trying to figure out what to do, but there was no avoiding it. He'd already seen me. When I finally got out of my car, he was standing right there waiting. His face looked like I'd never seen it before, not angry exactly, but hurt and determined in a way that scared me. He said he knew something was going on and he was going to find out what it was right now. I tried to convince him to leave, that this was my private therapy time and he was violating my boundaries, but he wasn't budging. We went up to the office together and I can't even describe the panic I felt walking down that hallway. The counselor's secretary wasn't at her desk. She usually left early on Thursdays. My husband knocked on the office door and waited. When the counselor opened it, expecting to see just me, the look of shock and fear on his face told my husband everything he needed to know. The confrontation that followed was brutal and messy. My husband demanded to know what was going on between us, and initially both the counselor and I tried to deny anything inappropriate was happening. But my husband isn't stupid and the guilty expressions on our faces were impossible to hide. The counselor's office suddenly seemed tiny and suffocating with all three of us in there. Eventually, the truth came spilling out, not all of it, but enough. The counselor admitted to crossing professional boundaries but tried to minimize it, calling it an emotional connection that had gotten out of hand. My husband's reaction was unlike anything I'd ever seen from him. He's usually the calm, measured type, but he was shaking with rage. He looked at me like he'd never seen me before, like I was a stranger wearing his wife's face. The counselor tried to take control of the situation, suggesting we all sit down and talk through this rationally, but my husband was having none of it. He told the counselor he was going to report him to every licensing board and professional organization he could find. He said he was going to make sure everyone knew what kind of person he really was. Then he looked at me and said we were done, not just with counseling, but with everything. I tried to follow my husband out of the building, but he told me not to come home that night. He said he needed time to think and couldn't stand to look at me. I ended up in a hotel room crying and calling the counselor over and over, but he wasn't answering his phone. The reality of what I'd done, what I'd thrown away, hit me like a truck. The next few days were a blur of horrible conversations, tears, and legal consultations. My husband moved out of our house temporarily and filed for separation. He wasn't just angry, he was methodical. He'd already been to see a lawyer and was building a case not just for divorce, but for a lawsuit against the counselor for professional misconduct. I found out later that he'd been documenting his suspicions for weeks, keeping track of my behavior changes and even recording some of our conversations at home. What I didn't know was that my husband had also been doing research on the counselor's background. He'd found some concerning information about previous complaints and wondered if what happened to us had happened to other couples. This wasn't just about our marriage anymore, it was about a pattern of predatory behavior that might have affected other vulnerable people seeking help. The counselor finally called me back 3 days after the confrontation, but it wasn't the conversation I was expecting. Instead of talking about our relationship or making plans for the future like he'd done before, he was panicked and focused only on damage control. He told me we needed to get our stories straight, that his career and livelihood were on the line. The romantic, caring person I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone who seemed primarily concerned with protecting himself. He suggested I tell my husband that I'd been confused and vulnerable, that he'd taken advantage of my emotional state during a difficult time in my marriage. While that was partially true, it felt like he was throwing me under the bus and minimizing my agency in what had happened. I realized that all his talk about our special connection and future together had probably been manipulation designed to keep me compliant and quiet. Update 2. 2 weeks ago, the legal and professional consequences started rolling in like an avalanche. My husband wasn't bluffing about reporting the counselor to licensing boards. He'd filed complaints with the State Psychology Board, the American Psychological Association, and the counselor's malpractice insurance company. He'd also consulted with a lawyer who specialized in professional misconduct cases and was building a civil lawsuit. But the biggest shock came when my husband's research uncovered something none of us had expected. The counselor had been investigated twice before for similar incidents with female clients, though nothing had been proven and no formal sanctions had been imposed. My husband found this information through online court records and professional disciplinary databases that are apparently public if you know where to look. Armed with this information, my husband's lawyer contacted the previous complainants. One of them agreed to speak with us, and her story was almost identical to mine. She'd been in couples counseling with her ex-husband 3 years ago. The same pattern of individual sessions had developed, and she'd ended up having an affair with the counselor that destroyed her marriage. The counselor had made the same promises about leaving his wife and being together, promises that evaporated the moment she became inconvenient. Learning about this other woman changed everything for me. I realized I hadn't been special or uniquely connected to this man. I'd been a victim of a calculated pattern of predatory behavior. The counselor was apparently specifically targeting women in vulnerable positions, using his professional authority and their emotional neediness to manipulate them into inappropriate relationships. The woman who'd been through this before had never taken legal action because she'd been too ashamed and hadn't known about the pattern. But now, with multiple victims willing to come forward, the case against the counselor became much stronger. She decided to join our lawsuit and file her own complaint with the licensing board. Meanwhile, my personal life was falling apart in ways I hadn't anticipated. My husband was still living separately and had made it clear that reconciliation wasn't something he was interested in discussing. He wasn't cruel or vindictive, but he was cold in a way that might have been worse than anger. He told me that the betrayal wasn't just about the physical affair, but about the lies, the manipulation of our therapy process, and the way I'd made him feel crazy for noticing changes in my behavior. Word about what had happened started spreading through our social circle despite our attempts to keep things private. People took sides, and most of them weren't on mine. Friends who'd known us as a couple were shocked and disappointed. Some people blamed the counselor entirely, viewing me as a victim, but others saw me as equally responsible for the affair and the destruction of my marriage. My family's reaction was particularly difficult to handle. My parents had always loved my husband and were devastated by the divorce. My mother couldn't understand how I could have thrown away a good marriage for someone who was clearly manipulating me. She kept asking what she'd done wrong as a parent, how she'd failed to teach me better judgment. The guilt and shame were overwhelming. But the most unexpected development came when I received a call from the State Psychology Board informing me that they wanted to interview me as part of their investigation. I learned that professional misconduct cases like this are serious business, potentially resulting in license suspension or revocation. The investigator explained that my testimony would be crucial in establishing a pattern of behavior and protecting future potential victims. The counselor's desperation became increasingly apparent as the investigation progressed. He called me repeatedly, sometimes crying, begging me to reconsider my cooperation with the authorities. He alternated between claiming he loved me and threatening that my testimony would destroy an innocent man's career. When I stopped taking his calls, he started showing up at places where he knew I'd be: my workplace, the grocery store, my gym. This stalking behavior became the final nail in his professional coffin. My husband's lawyer helped me file for a restraining order, which became part of the evidence in both the licensing board investigation and the civil lawsuit. The counselor's own actions were proving the case against him more effectively than any testimony could have. The investigative process was grueling and emotionally exhausting. I had to recount intimate details of the affair to strangers, explain my thought processes and decision-making during a time when I clearly wasn't thinking straight. The investigator was professional but thorough, asking questions that forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own behavior and choices. During this time, I started seeing a different counselor, a woman this time, someone recommended by the victim advocacy group that was helping with our case. This therapeutic process was completely different from what I'd experienced before. Instead of validation and sympathy, I got honest feedback about my choices and their consequences. It was harder but more genuine than the manipulative dynamic I'd mistaken for genuine care. Final update. Last week, the resolution to this nightmare finally came, though not in the way I'd expected when this all started. The State Psychology Board concluded their investigation and revoked the counselor's license permanently. The evidence of a pattern of predatory behavior with multiple victims was overwhelming, and the board's report was scathing in its assessment of his conduct. The civil lawsuit was settled out of court for a significant amount, enough to cover my husband's legal fees, my therapy costs, and provide some compensation for the damage to both our lives. The counselor's malpractice insurance company clearly wanted to avoid a public trial that would have generated even more negative publicity for their client. But the most surprising development was criminal charges. The district attorney's office decided to prosecute the counselor for sexual exploitation by a psychotherapist, which is a felony in our state. I hadn't even known such a law existed, but apparently when therapists use their professional position to engage in sexual relationships with clients, it's considered a form of rape because of the power imbalance and inability to give true consent. The criminal trial was brief but intense. The counselor pled guilty to reduced charges rather than face a jury trial with multiple victims testifying. He received 2 years in prison, 5 years probation, and lifetime registration as a sex offender. He also had to surrender his license in all states where he'd been certified and pay restitution to his victims. Watching him in court during the sentencing hearing was surreal. This person who had seemed so confident and authoritative in his office looked broken and pathetic in an orange jumpsuit. He made a statement apologizing to his victims and their families, but it felt hollow and scripted. The judge was particularly harsh in her comments, noting that he'd violated the trust of people who came to him for help during their most vulnerable moments. The other woman who'd been victimized by him spoke at the sentencing hearing, and her words were more powerful than anything the lawyers had said. She talked about how his manipulation had destroyed her marriage and made her question her own judgment for years afterward. She said that seeing him face consequences had finally given her some peace and closure. When it was my turn to speak, I talked about the ripple effects of his actions, not just on me, but on my husband, our families, and our entire community. I explained how his abuse of professional authority had made it harder for people to trust therapists and seek help when they needed it. I wanted him to understand that his selfish actions had consequences far beyond our individual relationship. My husband and I are divorced now, but the process was more amicable than it could have been given the circumstances. He testified as a witness in both the licensing board hearing and the criminal trial, and I think seeing me take responsibility and fight for justice helped him process some of his anger. We're not friends, but we're not enemies either. We both acknowledged that our marriage had problems before the affair, though nothing that justified what I did. I've learned more about myself in the past 6 months than in the previous 6 years. The therapy I'm doing now is helping me understand why I was vulnerable to manipulation, how to set better boundaries, and how to rebuild my life after making such destructive choices. It's hard work, but it feels authentic in a way that my previous therapeutic experience never did. The other victims and I have started a support group for people who've experienced professional misconduct by therapists. It's shocking how common these situations are and how few people know their rights or where to turn for help. We're working with victim advocacy organizations to raise awareness and push for stronger regulations in the mental health field. My relationship with my family is slowly healing, though trust takes time to rebuild. My parents are proud that I came forward and helped stop someone who was hurting vulnerable people, but they're still processing their disappointment about my choices. My siblings have been more supportive, probably because they're closer to my age and understand how easy it is to make terrible decisions when you're unhappy and desperate for connection. Professionally, I've had to rebuild my reputation and credibility. Word of the scandal affected my work relationships, and I ended up changing jobs to get a fresh start. The new position is actually better than my old one, and my supervisor knows about my situation and has been supportive. She's told me that my experience with the legal system and victim advocacy work could be valuable in helping other employees who face similar situations. Dating feels impossible right now, and honestly, I'm not sure I'm ready anyway. The counselor's manipulation made me question my ability to judge people's character and motives. I'm working on rebuilding my self-worth and learning to be content being alone rather than settling for attention from anyone who shows interest. It's a slow process, but I'm making progress. The strangest part of this whole experience has been the unexpected connections with other survivors. Through the support group and legal proceedings, I've met women who faced similar situations with doctors, teachers, clergy members, and other authority figures. There's a whole community of people rebuilding their lives after professional betrayal, and their strength and resilience have inspired me more than any therapy session ever could. Looking back, I can see all the red flags I ignored and all the moments when I could have made different choices. But I've also learned that manipulation by authority figures is designed to override normal judgment and decision-making processes. The counselor was skilled at what he did because he'd done it before and refined his techniques with each new victim. The legal consequences for him were just the beginning. His wife divorced him while he was in jail, and he lost his house and most of his assets in the settlement agreements with his victims. His children, who are adults, have cut off contact with him entirely. He'll be starting his life over at 55 years old as a registered sex offender with no career prospects in his chosen field. I don't feel sorry for him, but I do think about how different things could have been if he'd chosen to be ethical and professional. He could have had a successful career helping people, a stable family life, and the respect of his community. Instead, his need to exploit vulnerable women cost him everything and traumatized multiple families in the process. The healing process isn't linear, and I still have bad days when the shame and regret feel overwhelming. But I also have good days when I feel strong and proud of surviving something that could have destroyed me completely. I'm learning to forgive myself while still taking responsibility for my choices, which is a delicate balance that requires constant adjustment. This experience has changed my perspective on so many things: marriage, trust, authority, justice, and personal responsibility. I'm not the same person I was when I first walked into that counselor's office, and while the journey to get here was painful and destructive, I think I'm becoming someone stronger and wiser than I was before. The price was higher than I ever imagined, but the lessons learned may prevent me from making similar mistakes in the future.